Radio. We've got a special guest with us in studio today. We have Dr. Michelle Ramsey from Penn State Berks, which I messed up the first time, not the second now.
Totally fine.
We've had one interview before, and she'll be joining us for a special episode today. Darren, why don't you introduce what we're kind of be talking about, and then we'll say hello to Michelle.
Yeah, definitely. This is Darren and Micah, and as Micah said, we have Michelle Ramsey. She is the Associate Professor of Communication Arts and Scientists for Women's Gender Sexuality Studies at Penn State Berks. So we're going to have an interesting discussion about music, media, and gender expectations. So this is a show about music and entertainment. We find all parts of it fascinating. This is going to be a little departure from a normal approach, and we look forward to your feedback and comments for the show. So why don't we dive right in?
Yes, well, we'll say hello. Hello, Michelle.
Hello, and welcome to
Thank you.
welcome to Wimberley, Texas.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good to be here.
So again, it's Darren, Micah, and Michelle today. We're going to be discussing how media portrays the gender norms and roles in their delivery, specifically music and movies.
And if I could, you say your title and what you teach, and then you have some specific sections that you teach very much about pop culture. So can you explain a little bit what you teach at Berks, and then maybe our focus that we're going to do today?
Yeah, so I teach a number of communication courses. I teach the basic course that everybody loves, public speaking. I teach rhetoric of American horror film. I teach conflict management.
I love horror films, but please keep going.
Yes, we can talk more about that later. That's another show.
Yeah.
And then just a number of other different classes. But I do teach gender and communication. And there's a pretty significant part of that course because gender in media is one of my areas of research. We talk a good deal about gender representation in the media, television, film, music, and now gaming, video games, and
another
all these
area
different...
I really enjoy.
Yeah,
but I won't
and
derail
as
too much.
is always the case, a lot of work to be done in gender roles. Right?
Of course, I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
So I, Darren, stumbled across 3 different articles that have been written both in the last 2 months, in the last 60 days. And the articles were under the thing they had all in common was the underrepresentation of women in the music industry. It was primarily focused on the people working day to day, meaning sound engineers, producers, songwriters, performers. I was surprised to learn that the statistics were as strong as they were, meaning how many men dominated the music industry, because I don't think of music as a masculine or feminine thing. That doesn't particularly resonate with me. But why don't you talk about why you think this is the situation? Where does this challenge originate?
Yeah, so when you sent me those articles, there wasn't anything surprising in them for me, but I was sort of surprised that the one thing they didn't talk about was the fact of who runs record companies. So all the stats are about production and engineering and singer-songwriting, but all of those people get hired, right? A&R reps, all that stuff gets hired by the people at the top. Mm-hmm. And so we dug around a little bit and found that there's only recently been one woman added as the primary person on top. What would she be? Like maybe a CEO of
she's
Sony.
The CEO of Sony Music Entertainment.
Which is like that's the biggest of the big. That's the Google of the music industry.
And it happened.
She just hired 3 weeks ago.
3 weeks ago.
Just
Vanessa
happened.
Pickens.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Just happened.
That is like certainly a bit mind blowing. Glad though. Glad it happened.
Yeah.
And then it's not, and that makes a ton of sense because I think we do, especially as people think about music, we think about art, and we don't think about the business that runs art. Being a producer and owning my own studio, and helping artists, I fully see how much goes into it. I mean, I want to argue you don't have art without it, but you do, but you don't have it in the masses that it does. So that's a really interesting concept that I think a lot of us haven't spent much time pondering. Who's at the top of the food chain? And how is that trickling down and affecting the rest of the roles?
All those stats that Darren found are not organic. That's not how it would happen in nature, right?
Right.
It's very much systemic. And so who is hiring the producers and the engineers? Well, it's the very people at the very top. So it was interesting that those particular essays didn't mention that because
so
that's
they
where it
more
happens.
just I didn't actually have a chance to look them over. It more just mentioned the statistics of who held those positions, but it didn't actually talk about necessarily why or the potential cause.
Well,
little
the
bit.
why would have to presuppose that it was a problem. Although I guess the whole point of the article was
that it was
There's
say,
a
hey,
problem.
this kind of
Yeah, I think all.
why? How
all
can
were being
you
critical
write an
of that.
article about here's a challenge and here's the source of the challenge? I don't know how you solve something without.
But the way we tend to write, the way that the media tends to write about any issue, whether it's domestic violence or racism, it tends to be very individualized. So it's about a person. Or it's about the engineers, and there's not a discussion of the system, right? So how does the system encourage racism? How is structural sexism? What is that? What does it look like? How does it happen? And so media isn't good at talking about the structural sexism, structural racism.
It's harder, right? And
it is harder.
I think people are naturally lazy
hard.
and they don't want to. That's a complex problem.
It's easy
Writing
to throw
one
some
person's
stats.
story is far easier.
Yeah.
Than
it's complex.
Yes.
I mean,
it's complex.
Given our clickbait society too, I can imagine it's difficult to grab headlines, which is too bad, saying the systemic problem around this area of hiring. It's easier to say this person messed up. Let's point a camera on it and spend 30 minutes.
Or to count. Right. To just count. That's all. That's really all they did was they counted. Right. And they actually pointed to academic studies that had done the counting for them. So, it's accounting, and that's usul data. Absolutely.
Because it lets us know.
You're right. It points you to the fact that something systemic is happening. And if it were just one record company, then we'd say, okay, that's the bad apple sort of theory. But it's everywhere. It's everywhere. So it's systemic, and we need to talk about that.
Yeah, and seeing it permeate into the music industry, which affects, like you mentioned, producers, engineers, and singer-songwriters, but being in the music industry, so much more. I mean, you can really go down to the impacts it has on the exact songs, to the impact it has on the images that are created, to the impact it has on anything.
Do you have a topic or a specific example off the top of your head? I definitely want to get to that later in this discussion, but do you have one that jumps to mind?
I mean, as I've worked with people in Nashville and LA, like something that I can speak to is being a lyricist and a songwriter, and I can tell you where they say don't like. And they're pretty hard lines when you have lyrics that I'm working with, say, somebody in Nashville, and they have a very bottled formula. And you give a lyrical composition that's just outside of how they would expect
but how much
it.
is that is related to gender norms or sexism versus just
I would
they
argue,
know what sells?
I'm dipping into territory where my toes are off the edge, but you're probably more founded here. I would imagine it's a ton because it seems like the words create the brand, creates the music video, which we're going to get into in a second, right? And the music video creates the audience and the attention, and the person that's overseeing this whole thing has an idea of what this looks like. So when I'm writing about, trucks and roads and girls and bubbles and stuff, and salts and
Never
tequila.
write about bubbles.
Well, I find that bubbles show up a lot around cars and things, even as jokes, but poorly worded. But yes, maybe more tequila. Regardless, it's now pondering it as I'm requested for these things. It makes more sense as I'm as you get X's, and it's amazing how rigid those walls are, and there's somebody's making that call, and obviously we know now it's not a woman.
It's not. And I think that's why it's so important to have women in those rooms is because those men don't choose stories that don't resonate with them.
This is my favorite.
That makes more sense.
She clarified.
It makes more sense. I understand that comment.
That resonates with me too.
Right.
No matter how I try to educate and be different and be outside myself, you really aren't.
It's hard.
It's very difficult.
It's hard, and when you want to be successful, so in other words, I'm not trying to say they are purposefully making these choices, though I think sometimes that does it, depending on the person, right? But I think more organically, we are drawn to stories that resonate with us, and so when you're a producer deciding what stories are going to be told. You're going to have bias towards the ones that resonate with you, that mean something to you, that you've experienced. And so that's why we have so much of that.
See, I think I want to talk about the word bias. And if you're just joining us, This is Darren and Micah. We are speaking with Dr. Michelle Ramsey, associate professor at Penn State Berks, where she focuses on sexuality studies, women's studies, and gender roles at Penn State Berks. So let's talk about. We're going to talk about here in a second why this is all important, why we're even talking about this. But I want to shoehorn in the word bias. I think that when an academic uses the word bias, what people hear is that it's an intentional omission or prejudice applied to somebody. Is it not true that the word bias means you're going to filter through your decisions through your life experience and stuff? Bias is not necessarily a negative word, is it?
No, bias is, you can have biases can do good things.
Right.
And so, for instance, if I were a producer and my bias was getting different stories out, then that bias could be useful in the goal of more equity in music. What I think people conflate is discrimination and bias.
Right.
Bias and prejudice are brain activity. Discrimination is the action.
Right.
So the bias encourages that discrimination, and regardless of whether that discrimination is intentional or not, somebody says, I just don't want women in the industry. They don't belong there. Most often, I suspect it's just bias. And again, what stories resonate and what don't. And also, I think, especially the big media companies are pretty lazy.
Yeah.
It's the reason why we see this same sorts of movies over and over and over, and you have to see independent film to get a different story or different narrative. It's easy to make stuff that's already popular. That's already proven itself.
Those companies don't want to take risks.
No.
And the artist does.
Yeah, they're a business.
And
they're not musicians.
I don't know if it's laziness as much as fear, because they're publicly traded companies.
Yeah.
Right.
And if they go and try to make, the pioneers take the first arrows, right? And you don't want to be the person that sticks his or her neck out there to try to change things, have it fail, and ultimately you'll get fired because if God forbid, the stock share goes down $2 a share, that's bad.
No, they're not interested in loss, at all, even if it's for a good cause.
I think
so. Let's
real quick. I think something that you said that's important to me too, and back to the word bias.
Yeah.
And I think the focus is it can be kind of easy to focus on a prejudice or something that's showing up with action, but the unconscious bias is, I think, the conversation that we're finally having a little bit more of and looking at, and that's that unconscious bias of I do think there's a lot of people that make actions, like you're saying, based on songwriting or hiring, and they're not even really thinking about it. When it's legit prejudice or discrimination, you can sometimes pinhole it more.
And it's gender roles too, right? So you can even take it outside of music. If the hiring manager at a bank, their perception of a banker or bank vice president is masculine. We do this in politics all the time, right? Our universal politician is always male. And so anybody off of that very, very specific sort of identity is something a lot of people won't.
It's a variation from the norm, yeah.
I think their bias is, in that example of the politician and government official, I think it's still based a lot in fear that this woman looks different from me. I don't have any experience with somebody that looks like this. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to relate in a productive way. And so therefore, this guy looks more like me, more familiar.
I feel like we're pretty base creatures at the end of the day.
Yeah.
We are. And if you want to expand that line of thought, to me, I would argue that's what's happening right now in our culture politically, right?
Yep.
Is that all of a sudden the world, the United States, doesn't look like it always did.
Right.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people are really scared of that because they're scared of the unknown, and that's human, right?
It's literally like survival based.
Yeah, but you got to be smarter than that.
I love the line. I think it's from Good to Great. What got you here won't get you there.
Yeah.
And we're in one of those big moments.
That's
I say
a really good one.
I say it a lot when I teach guitar or any instrument, and I typically try to be like, look, I'm going to tell you this about guitar, but I mean this in a bigger situation. Yeah. We're in that moment now, in the U.S. and a number of places, but what got us here won't get us there. And if we can make the change, I genuinely feel everything will be a lot better.
So let's shift the conversation as to why more inclusion or more diversity is important in pop culture, in media, and let's focus on those two. So, Michelle, you had some thoughts as to why this is important to be more inclusive of different. Let's just focus on gender for now. Why is this important?
So I think it's two connected things. I think first of all, when people kind of balk at me teaching a rhetoric of American horror film class, it's pop culture, it's garbage. No, kids line up for those films. Yeah. I lined up for music, and it was because I was getting something out of it, right? Film, TV, radio, it's all storytelling. It's all storytelling. And so we learn from media, what should we look like? What should we try to, and what should we try to be? What should we value or not value? And you think back to your own, your music mattered when you were growing up, so I identified as sort of a new wave punk kid, and that identity mattered to me. And so we find our identities in mass media a lot.
I never thought that until the advancement of social media. I see so many research reports and videos to where somebody will be on the street and they'll show a picture of Kim Kardashian and every person on the street can name her. But then they show a picture of the vice president and it's like 30% can name. So, I mean, we are genuinely, I think this is the core of why this does matter. We are truly, truly celebrity obsessed in this country, and maybe it is everywhere. But what your point is, if I'm understanding, is the reason why is to have more balance, because it impacts acceptance, who we are supposed to be, who we're expected to be, and so many people are put under this pressure to act in certain ways, and they may not feel that way. Is that right?
Yeah, and so having a variety of stories matters, because we kind of were talking about this before MTV came out. I mean, you had the radio, and growing up in small town Texas, I was a prisoner to whatever the radio wanted to play. When MTV comes out, I can go past Louisville, Texas, and I can go into England, and in places that my radio stations weren't going yet. And so I got different stories. And I think that's the first piece, right? That songs are storytelling. We look for ourselves in those stories. We find ourselves in those stories, and we make meaning. If we expand the kind of stories that get told, one of the things about prejudice and bias and this being scared of the other is it's a fear of the unknown. So if you open up the storytelling, and you let some light in on what people are scared about, and they can see. I mean, it's why Ellen coming out was so important. It's why Cosby's there are issues now, but in the 80s Cosby was important for a reason. Sure. Because they were different stories being told about an American black family. And so that's why that diversity is important, because it can help us get over our biases and our scared of the otherness sort of stuff. Yeah. So it's super important. So when people sort of, balk about, taking a class in pop culture, there isn't, I would argue there isn't much more, save maybe our family, that tells us what to do, how to do it, what to look like. We get more cues from that than anything else other than our family.
And without experiencing these things firsthand, and like your experience would have been MTV in a base level, there's no desire or really motivation for adjustment. Like just an example, I guess, that I do all the time is songwriting. I used to write by myself solely, and then I wrote with my best friend who's a guy. Now I write with lots of songwriters, and I promise you, the best songs come from 5 different people from different areas coming together and writing a song. We could probably have a whole show based around the impact of MTV.
Oh my gosh, yes. Sign
me up.
It was a big deal.
It was huge for us.
Really big deal.
So I was born in '85.
Right.
I caught it as it was like shifting. So I guess I would have kind of been in the eye of the hurricane, because at 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old,
right.
It was finally everywhere.
It was like I grew up knowing nothing without MTV.
Right.
I didn't know that it didn't exist. It's a really wonderful. I mean, I guess in essence, it has probably a ton of negatives that came out of it, but it has to have had a ton of positives
Absolutely.
that came out. I mean, just the story that you told me right there sounds amazing. A kid growing up in Texas, now imagine that across the globe, all of a sudden has access to Italy artists and Europe and California and everybody. And it's not just auditory. Right. And you couldn't find it. It's now visual, which is kind of where we were heading as well.
For me, I think it had a positive thing because the first, outside of my grandmother and my mom, my immediate family, my first experience with strong women, I think, was Tina Turner. Not only for her story of leaving her abusive husband, but she physically looked strong. She was muscular, right?
She controlled the stage.
She sure did.
And she was physically strong later in life, right? Where she got in shape and all this. I remember being a great admirer of the tennis player Martina Navratilova because she was she made herself into a champion. She was doing CrossFit workouts before CrossFit was a thing.
There was
but TV and the mass media brought that to me, and for me, the idea of a strong woman is not a big deal. I don't know, because I did grow up with a typical macho father type from that generation. I don't know that I would have had, I wouldn't have had that. With growing up with two brothers, I would not have had that experience had the media not brought that world. So in that case, it did help for sure. It does shape you.
I agree.
And
yeah, they had I saw a really good conversation labeling the
so we have about 9 minutes left. I'm just I would love to talk more about some of the examples. You know, the question is, all right, we've established that storytelling, music, lyrics, production all have impact on our growth and how we see the world. But Michelle, Dr. Ramsey, do you have any examples that you'd like to talk about? And I certainly do. I'm sure Micah does as well, too.
Yeah, so when we were talking about it, I was thinking about, our time growing up. And so in terms of the visual stuff, and I think there are two directions to sort of take this. The first is the visuals that were so important for MTV. And so when I teach this stuff in class, I talk about Nick Rhodes from Duran Duran and Annie Lennox from the Eurythmics, and I show pictures where they're almost impossible to identify from the other. You really have to know who they are. Students can't really see it. And so there was this beautiful androgyny that started really in the 70s with the New York Dolls and Iggy Pop and David Bowie. But the visual, you had to be in very specific places to see that. And MTV, we got to start seeing all that. Right. The other group that you started playing with gender was those heavy metal groups like Motley Crue, Poison, and all of that. And so they're hyper feminized in their faces and their makeup and their hair, which brought women to heavy metal for in large numbers, I think, for the first
Absolutely
time.
And
and the power ballad becomes a thing.
Yep.
And women are swooning over all of that. But then in the background of that, just in case we thought they were too feminine, there's stacks of huge amps, and there's pyrotechnics, and there's just sort of, and really sexualized movement with instruments and things like that. So hyper masculine performance, but hyper feminine sort of visual in their face and their hair.
And softness about it too.
But it it brought women in.
Yeah.
And if you listen to some of the interviews of some of those folks, that's exactly why they did it.
Well, the artists from the 70s that did the gender bending role, I wasn't aware of until the 80s when the MTV showed a retrospective of what it used to. I had no access of that stuff. But yeah, the very beginning of that was more of the second British invasion with modern English and Adam Ant and those people, and that was in the early 80s. And then glam hair metal jumped on the bandwagon. I think they saw it, and they did make it okay with all the other stuff, which I never thought of until now. But it was shocking to see 22-year-old guys wearing lip gloss and big giant hair spray hairdos. But it did. I remember the audience changing distinctly from all male to 50-50 when the metal guys started glamming up. It made it okay for women to show up.
I wonder where 100%. That decision originated, what band like feels like made that push.
I don't know. I think we probably could figure it out if we looked.
We probably could. There has to be like a quintessential moment.
It was that LA strip scene, you know, that that is so legendary. All those bands.
Well, I don't know that there was if you want to know who was first, there was a band called Hanoi Rocks, but they never got big, and they had one of their
typically how
primary
that
people
goes.
die. But they were early adopters, 80, 81.
Yeah,
but I think in terms of mainstream, I think it was Motley Crue that was the first that sort of broke that mold. And they did temper it because they had some satanic imagery that with their biggest albums called Shout at the Devil, but they did it with white makeup and big hair and lip gloss and very feminized type clothes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, and Madonna was a big part of that too. Madonna wore a lot of men's clothes and blazers and pushed the norms here too. And I think if you want to look at today's world, somebody that does it exceptionally well, we're talking about sort of break the gender norms, is Miley Cyrus. So she's a very feminine looking person. However, she tends to dress it a lot in men's clothes with blazers, or she wears a dress, she wears combat boots with it. And I think she's excellent at pushing those norms. Do you think Billie Eilish is that way?
I would put Billie more than Miley, but I don't know. I mean, whatever. I guess I don't need to compare the two, but I think Billie definitely has that. I mean, Billie came out dressing much more goth, Hot Topic, baggy clothes, and then went through her complete shift of her branding and imagery, which I've just loved watching that career. We joked about this last time. And anybody that's listening here on KWVH, Wimberley Valley Radio, I am a huge fan of Billie Eilish, have it be known. If you don't know Billie Eilish, her brother Phineas is also really fantastic. They both have really great art careers. I think Billie pushed it. I
don't see Billie as gender bending at all. I think she's a Southern California girl who dresses very casual and skateboardish.
I would invert Miley and Billie's dialogue. I think Billie has offered much more outlets for younger girls that don't. Like, Miley played the SoCal role through Disney and then broke that. Billie did the exact opposite. Played the conservative, baggy, gothy, not putting my face first, more introverted, and then broke that mold. I definitely think, and if you look at her cast,
that's not gender bending though. A lot of young women.
Well, I'll let Dr. Ramsey tell us. Why don't you fill us in, Dr. Ramsey?
Well, I mean, okay, so I want to start with sort of grounding that conversation a little bit, because I think it's important. And this goes back to storytelling. So when you think about us growing up in the 80s and getting MTV, you had, well, before that, you had Leslie Gore, right, in the late 60s, talking about You Don't Own Me, which is so different from all the other music that women were putting out at that time.
And it seems so silly to even hear now that would even be something that somebody should have to say.
Right.
But I get
it's
it, though.
Huge. And so that's right as the second wave of feminism is starting to take hold in this country. So I don't think that's an accident. Then you have Madonna and you have Cyndi Lauper. Cyndi Lauper's video Girls Just Want to Have Fun. She's in the street. She is pushing men out of the way.
Right.
And all these women are pushing men out of the way on the street. That's important as a girl in Texas to see.
But I wonder, you know, that video probably wouldn't have got approved with her doing that if she didn't do it in such a half comical way and dressed the kind of way. If she did it with a snarl on her face, I'm not sure if accepted. No,
but
she did it while she was dancing
that men would be
singing.
Comfortable with. But I mean, so think about those people. Think about Alanis Morissette in 95, right? Jagged Little Pill comes out. People lost their collective minds because she talks about going down on somebody in a theater. Something men have talked about in euphemism and non-euphemism for decades. And people went bonkers. But women, many women, especially people my age, were like, oh, she's telling a story that resonates with me. Maybe not that particular scene, but being mad at someone who broke up with you, who promised you forever. Like, men talk about that stuff all the time.
And just being able to say it.
And say it, right? And if it had been a ballad, that would have been different. But it wasn't, right? It was rip-roaring guitars. It was anthemic. I mean, it was just fantastic. And then I think I think then we lose it, right? We get the Britneys and the Christinas, which have value for themselves in different ways. I'm not dogging on them, but they didn't have that impact. They kind of went back. It was sort of the backlash.
That sense of like raw reality of things that are happening. It was very bubblegummy.
Right. It was very produced, right? Hyper produced images.
I think that's also media driven by Nickelodeon and Disney.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
They created a formula.
Right.
Well,
and it's a sick
man, we
formula.
can replicate this, right?
I'll just say it.
Man.
I can't stand Disney, and it's a sick formula to put out these, this like image of goody and you don't break the rules, and you don't have sex before marriage. This is Disney. But you hypersexualize the Jonas Brothers. You hypersexualize
guys,
Miley,
girls, everybody.
And so it's this real weird contradiction that I think is problematic. But
well, it wasn't around, and we're out of time. But that Disney Nickelodeon thing wasn't around in the '80s because those channels didn't exist.
Right.
They didn't come until late '90s. Yeah. And but then they're like, oh man, we have built an avenue to sell this.
I must shut it down.
Yes.
We are out of our time because we could do this for a long time.
Okay.
And you guys can watch some more of the Damn Music Show if you want. We will be having more conversations
on our YouTube channel.
On our YouTube channel with Dr. Michelle Ramsey. Dr. Michelle, I'm so sorry to have to end it, but I have two questions for you.
Yeah.
Is Billie Eilish, this is a yes or no question, gender bending? Ish. Done. Is Miley Cyrus gender bending?
Yes, they both are.
Yeah,
they both are.
So
That's the
much.
thing.
We're
Really
gonna put
quickly, I know
videos
you're
I'm
out
gonna
of time.
show you.
Darren's gonna mansplain me.
Yes, I am gonna mansplain.
Zip it. Gender is a continuum, right?
I agree.
And so both of them can be those things.
Yeah,
and I think that the reason that my final point I want to make is those stories are important because they give young people an alternative to the standard media narrative, and all those pressure points that we talk about, Madonna and Alanis.
Feel good if they're like that. They're like, I'm not the only one.
That's right. I'm not the only one.
I must do my job and shut it down. All right.
Good job, Micah.
I'll be a typical guy here. Is Billie Eilish awesome? Yes. Thank you for your response. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Darren and Micah and today Dr. Michelle Ramsey show here at KWVH Wimberley Valley Radio 94.3 FM. We will catch you guys on the next show, or come hang with us on our YouTube channel, The Damn Music Show.
Yay.
Until next time. Later.